Let me start by asking a question, and this is one of those God forbid kind of questions. If America utterly collapsed and shattered into fragments that could not be glued back together, and you and your family were among the survivors, what would you encourage other survivors to build upon the ruins? Would it be what we currently have, a nation founded on the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the government established by the Constitution? Would it be something else entirely? Our answer matters because it goes to our understanding of what has been handed down to us by our founding fathers and how we feel about that original vision. And it goes to the very heart of the vision we have for what America will become. The answer to this question is also monumentally important because it is my contention that over 100 years ago, another group of people began to look with disdain upon what our founding fathers had given to us and began to envision creating a new America. And we call those people secular progressives. Now, it seems clear that we are witnessing the kind of divisiveness in America that has not been seen since the late 1960s. The political polarization, the racial animosity, the disrespect for the flag, the violence on college campuses and in inner cities. When Pat Buchanan, addressing the Republican National Convention in 1992, famously labeled this divide as a culture war, he was ridiculed by the mainstream media and proclaimed an element of the fringe in our country. Now no one doubts the accuracy of Pat Buchanan's assessment. Of course, much has changed since the 1960s or the 1990s when Buchanan was speaking. However, the hostility between the right and the left is white hot, and that has not changed. We might not be as badly divided as the America that fought on battlefields during the Civil War, but suddenly that no longer seems like an impossibility. Now, at its most fundamental level, this is not a war about mere cultural values or even public policies like abortion, same-sex marriage, sex, those kinds of issues. At its heart, instead, this is a war, I believe, over the subject of God. Is He real? Is He the God of the Bible? Did He create mankind? Does He care about what we do? Do His commandments apply to us here in America? Will He one day judge each and every person? Does God judge nations as well as individuals? These are the questions behind the hostility. They are questions that had, with minimal dissent, been settled at the founding of our country. Even those founders who were not evangelical Christians knew our nation could not survive without God. They believed God had had His hand on those who fought the American Revolution and that God had granted us liberty. They knew that the constitutional republic that they eventually established could not succeed without an educated and involved citizenry, whose lives were anchored by what George Washington called the indispensable supports of religion and morality. This edition of the Cultural Institute is about those foundational principles, which are rooted first and foremost in a Christian view of the world and nature and the God of that nature. This presentation is also about a group of people who despise those principles. They have been in the process of overthrowing the foundation of America without ever asking a single citizen of this nation for permission to do so. The Bible teaches that creation reveals the Creator. We might say that God speaks to us. The Bible is clear on this point. From the very first, then God said in Genesis 1 to the final promise of Christ's return in Revelation 22, God is speaking. In Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, the writer says, God, after He spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in His Son. Jesus Christ reveals God the Father to mankind, and the church, through the preaching of the gospel, makes this revelation plain. It is this gospel and the entirety of the divine revelation contained in Scripture that leads people to salvation. However, God also speaks to mankind through nature, and although this voice is not the gospel, it still reveals the Creator in ways that are meant to help mankind order their lives here on the earth. And there is perhaps no clearer statement of that principle and that truth in the Bible than the one penned by the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 21. In that passage, Paul says this, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened." Now, in this passage, Paul lays out a logical argument in 4 parts, and I want to share that with you. First, Paul makes clear that God reveals Himself in nature. Romans 1, the passage I just read, says creation, what has been made, reveals His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature. It also instructs men and women about how they should live as beings that bear the divine image. Now, the Bible contains countless examples of God speaking through nature. Sometimes it is in the form of a metaphor or simile, as in Psalm 1. In that chapter, the righteous man is portrayed as one who delights himself in the Lord and meditates upon the Word of God. The psalmist says, "He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in whatever he does, he prospers." On other occasions, we're commanded to observe nature itself, how it behaves, and to emulate it. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 6 says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways and be wise." Since God is the one who created ants to behave in this manner, observing their activities can instruct us. Sometimes even the natural behavior of human beings reveals aspects of God's nature, as in the love of a mother for her children. It says in Isaiah 49, verse 5, "Can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, but I will not forget you." Like an artist who discloses his heart through the work that he fashions, God has manifested certain aspects of His nature through creation, and it reveals the artist, capital A, artist of all artists. Second of all, Paul says that what God revealed in nature can be understood. Paul says these truths about God can be clearly seen and understood, he says, through what has been made. It is made evident to them. That is, the revelation of God is clear and unmistakable. However, this revelation is not simply something that is external to human beings, because Paul says these truths are evident within them. There is an internal recognition of God's existence. Now, this understanding, this recognition even extends to morality. For example, Paul says in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, he speaks there of Gentiles or non-Jews who do not have the law of God, but nevertheless, he says, do instinctively the things of the law, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Number 3 in this passage, Paul says men and women actively repress this testimony. They suppress it. So not everyone who recognizes this natural sense of right and wrong heeds it. In Romans chapter 1, after Paul discusses how men and women suppress the knowledge of God, he proceeds to list the sinful things that they do as a result. He concludes the chapter by stating that sinners know they are doing wrong. In verse 32, Paul says, "Although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them." When they understand God's voice in nature, Paul says most people suppress the truth. In fact, this entire passage, right through the end of Romans chapter 1, verse 32, presents a series of dark choices made by people who see and understand the truth about God, yet willfully reject it. Why did they reject the truth seen in nature, this truth about God? Paul says they suppressed it in unrighteousness. Truth convicts the conscience of sin, and conviction is painful for people. We don't like it. None of us do, really, if we're honest. Rather than repent, however, people find that the easiest cure for the pain of conviction is to suppress what caused it in the first place. In this case, the testimony of nature about the reality of God. Now, this tendency of people to reject what nature reveals about God runs deep in humanity. Jesus taught that even when He came to testify about God in undeniable clarity, men and women turned away. He says in John chapter 3, "This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed." That's in John chapter 3, verses 19 through 20. So again, we see the pattern. People loved their sin and did not want it exposed to the light. Therefore, they rejected the truth proclaimed by Jesus Christ and preferred to hide in the darkness where, in their minds at least, the light could not penetrate. And finally, the fourth argument that Paul is making in this section of Romans chapter 1 is that the clarity of God's voice in nature condemns man's rebellion. Romans 1 says that the wrath of God comes and it is poured out against, he says, all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men because they are without excuse. Now, it must be stressed again, I want to make this clear, that men and women cannot be saved by God's voice in nature. They can only be saved through the preaching of the gospel. Paul makes that clear in Romans chapter 10, verse 14. However, Paul makes clear that mankind's rebellion against the testimony of nature is sufficient grounds for their damnation. In Romans chapter 1, verse 18, Paul says that the wrath of God is not only of an eternal nature, it is temporal too. It is revealed, Paul says. Not just it will be revealed, it is revealed now, in this age, and not only in the age to come. This passage then, I believe, is ominous news for our America. For example, what the Supreme Court has decided regarding the nature of marriage demonstrates the truthfulness of what Paul has been saying in Romans chapter 1. It's terrifying to see national leaders embrace an ideology that is clearly a suppression of the truth. Our founding fathers also understood that creation revealed the will of God, both in regard to morality and the concept of human rights. We'll see this in a moment. Not only are our current leaders turning their backs on God, but they are overthrowing the wisdom of those who laid the foundations upon which our republic exists. It might very well be that God's judgment will take the form of our forfeiture of liberty. And that would be enough, I believe, to make our founders and even the Apostle Paul weep. The founders saw moral truth in creation, and there are, of course, many ways in which God reveals Himself, but God does reveal Himself in nature. And what we have seen in Romans chapter 1, our founders understood as being a revelation of certain things that they used as foundation, building blocks, if you will, for our country. The first of those is the concept of objective laws. Now, one way in which men and women manifest the image of God is in their capacity to reason. Simply defined, reason is the power of comprehending, inferring, or thinking, especially in orderly, rational ways. That's just according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Daniel Mark, who is an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University, said, quote, "The same God who created the world is the same God that endowed us with the power of reason to understand that world and to understand His goodness." By this power of reason, mankind was able to understand that there is an objective reality in nature that we are called, as created beings, to discover and embrace. And some of the more obvious examples of this process of discovery are the physical laws that have been understood by science. Many of the scientific names that we have come to admire, Johann Kepler and Isaac Newton and Louis Pasteur, Gregor Mendel, and many others, they were individuals whose work reflected this view of the world. There are objective realities. As scientists, they are called to go out and discover what those are. They believed that since God had fashioned nature in an orderly way, it therefore operated according to physical laws. The job of the scientist was to understand these laws of nature, as we've come to call them, draw conclusions from those laws, and make applications that benefited humanity. Second of all, one of the building blocks that our founders established for our country is the idea of objective rights. So there's objective laws, but there are also objective rights. Distinct from the scientific laws of nature was a philosophical perspective called natural law. Now, this view of the world, which was firmly entrenched in the minds of our founders, held that there are also philosophical laws that God has established in His creation. We are required to apprehend those as well. We are called to look at the laws of nature, but we are also called to look at natural law, these kinds of philosophical laws. And we see this in the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson said that, quote, "the laws of nature and of nature's God," end quote, entitled the nations of the earth to a separate and equal station. Now, in the context of history, this was a striking statement. Jefferson was arguing on behalf of the American colonies that people had a right to govern themselves because God had purposed that it be so. Nature itself, in other words, demonstrated this in ways that were so clear that Thomas Jefferson said they could be understood as laws. In the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is undoubtedly one of the most famous phrases in modern history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now that statement is breathtaking in its implications. Jefferson acknowledges the existence of a God who created us, and with that life-giving act, also made it clear that we are equal before Him. In turn, that equality meant that we all had certain rights that could not lawfully, that is, in the eyes of our Creator, be abridged by governments. So when Jefferson stated that such truths were self-evident, he's referencing natural law. The reality was objectively true, just as much as the laws of science. Human beings who were empowered with reason were expected to see and understand the breadth of blessings bestowed upon mankind by our Creator. The third building block of our founders was objective morality. Individuals, our founders believed, were also expected to act as created beings who understood natural law. Once people understood it, once they understood natural law, they were then to conform their individual and corporate morality to it, as well as conform the laws they created. Hadley Arkes of Amherst College, he's a professor of jurisprudence there, said that Jefferson's famous statement was rooted in, quote, objective truths and the ways that are rightful and wrongful for the ordering of human life and the governance of human beings. Of course, once you use the words rightful and wrongful, we understand that we're discussing morality. That's what morality is. So our founders did not believe that these concepts of right and wrong were matters of mere human opinion. They came from the very nature of the world that God created. Peter Lilbach, who's president and professor of historical theology and church history at Westminster Theological Seminary, said that the founding generation believed standards of morality, quote, actually come to us from the very nature of reality, from the nature of creation, end quote. This view of natural law does not detract in any way from divine revelation, but merely augments it. When it comes to God's will for mankind, it is directly revealed by God in Scripture, but the will of God is indirectly revealed in nature. That's what our founders believed. Theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas said, quote, "The divine law we know through revelation, but the natural law we know by the reasoning that is accessible to human beings as human beings," end quote. According to Robert George, who's McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, he said that reason was such a powerful instrument that even unbelievers could comprehend much of what was right and wrong in God's eyes. Quote, in his letter to the Romans, St. Paul refers to a law that is written on the hearts, even of the Gentiles who did not have the law of Moses. It is a law that is capable of enabling people to understand the difference between right and wrong in at least some matters, a law that is sufficient for accountability and even for judgment. And that leads me to the fourth and final building block of our founders. These are the building blocks under our republic. What Robert George was talking about, of course, was referring to eternal judgment. The fact that every person knows in his or her heart what is right and wrong means each person is culpable before a holy judge. While it is true that natural law cannot save the lost, as I said before, it is certainly sufficient to damn them if they ignore it. Interestingly, the American founders also believed that ignoring natural law with its objective morality and all of its objective rights could result in national judgment. Even Thomas Jefferson, who by any stretch, reasonable estimate, was certainly no evangelical Christian, even Thomas Jefferson believed that the future of the republic depended greatly on whether or not the American people obeyed God. This is sometimes ignored when discussions of Thomas Jefferson are brought up. One of his most famous quotes, which is summarized on the wall inside the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., states this, quote, "And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that His justice cannot sleep forever." So in their rush to overthrow natural law as the foundation of the republic, secular progressives are risking the republic itself. And I think that that is something that Thomas Jefferson would call self-evident. Now, it is my belief that humanists have sought to, and in many ways have succeeded in overthrowing the foundations of our republic. For well over a century, secular progressives in the United States have worked tirelessly to alter the very nature of our republic. In all of the ways that count the most, they have very nearly succeeded. Moreover, they never asked Americans for permission to do so. Now, what we're talking about is basically humanism, and humanism as an ideology is the rejection of God and the elevation of man to the highest place on earth. And if humanism is the engine, then secular progressivism, as I'll show, is the steering wheel. It is a belief in the power of man, specifically unlimited, unfettered government, to progress or better the world. Now, the republic given to us by the Founding Fathers was anchored in a totally different and mutually exclusive belief system, which was the concept of natural law and natural rights, themselves those ideas rooted in the Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, these ideas, who were so central to the founding generation, were rejected by this new generation of secular progressives that was determined to reformulate America as a humanistic enterprise. Now, many conservatives believe the progressive movement is relatively recent, perhaps stemming from the upheavals of the 1960s. And while modern liberalism does go by the word progressive, the 60s merely added a clearer sexual dimension to the original political ideology. The origin of progressivism in America is found in the post-Civil War era, roughly between 1880 and 1920. Now, that was a time in our history that saw great changes that were being wrought by technology. Also, it was a time of cultural upheaval. Perhaps most importantly, there were undercurrents of ideological change that were sweeping Western civilization. And these undercurrents were the result of philosophical shockwaves. I mean, these were like earthquakes in Europe. And perhaps most critical of these was Darwinian evolution. Following the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859, evolutionary thought began to threaten the religious foundations of Western civilization and gave birth to an entirely new way of looking at truth, and actually an entirely new way of looking at mankind himself. And central to the sea change that was wrought by evolutionary theory was that truth itself was only found in scientific fact. Everything else was relative. Everything else was malleable, was temporary. It could be molded and changed. It could be discarded. It could be embraced for a time and then thrown away, because science was the only foundation for human existence. Now, Thomas West, who's a professor of politics at Hillsdale College, said, quote, "Relativism is the view that there is objective knowledge only of facts, but not of values. Science can know the truth about the material world, but it cannot tell us how to live," end quote. Now, these new ideas swept through American universities, West said, and progressive educational reformers like John Dewey, or even political leaders like eventual President Woodrow Wilson, carried the flag. Dewey had all kinds of influence on America's public education system. Matthew Spalding, who's an associate vice president at Hillsdale College of the Alan Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies, he said, quote, "They understood," meaning progressives, "they understood that you have to get control of the levers of power. They started magazines, they started think tanks, they started other institutions to try to get a hold of those politics and reshape other institutions along the way." So like an invasive virus, this new and alien ideology spread through the bloodstream of American power. Progressive ideas captured not only law schools, which would produce critical progressive Supreme Court decisions by mid-century. Sadly, they also took over and conquered many Christian seminaries. And we see entire denominations struggling with the fallout of the loss of Christian seminaries to humanist and humanistic values. This plan to alter the DNA of the Republic, at least in terms of co-opting, we might say, the intellectual class, was wildly successful. By the end of the 1920s, Roscoe Pound, who was dean of Harvard Law School at that time, was able to say with confidence that, quote, "The cycle is complete. We are back to the governing state as the unchallengeable authority behind legal precepts. The state takes the place of Jehovah, handing the tablets of the law to Moses." Now, this concept of relativism was not only aimed at religion, but also included political philosophies such as those that motivated the founders. Even the pivotal and foundational doctrines beneath the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. These principles were also considered relativistic and open to outright dismissal, and that's exactly what progressives did. They dismissed these founding principles. After all, if evolution is true, then there is no God, or at least there is no need for consulting Him when considering how Americans should order their governing principles. If there is no God, then there is no natural law for which human beings should look. There is simply nothing there to see. There's simply nothing there to understand. And so this string of ideas led to two problematic conclusions. First is that there is no such thing as human nature. This is what progressives clearly taught. In fact, John Dewey said that human beings have no nature. They are born as empty vessels or as blank slates. We see this kind of thing, spoken all the time when considering children, that they are blank slates and they're there to be taught, and there is no human nature that they are born with. So If that's true, if the progressive ideas regarding human nature are true, how do human beings become what they ultimately are? Well, according to people like Dewey, human beings are formed and fashioned by their cultural and historical surroundings. That's what creates human beings. Dewey said, quote, "Social arrangements, laws, institutions are means of creating individuals. Individuality in a social and moral sense is something to be wrought out or worked out." And for progressives like Dewey, government would become the ideal incubator and director of human nature. Now, if there is no God and there is no natural law, there was a second problematic conclusion that played out in this ideology of progressivism, and some might call it legitimately terrifying, and that is the progressive denial of natural human rights. Thomas West said, quote, "There can be no natural rights because there is nothing of any value that human beings possess by nature that they could be said to have a right to." And then he cited this startling statement by Dewey, quote, "Natural rights and natural liberties exist only in the kingdom of mythological social zoology," close quote. Well, this is a complete rejection of the Declaration of Independence. And as we'll see later on, progressives had no problem with saying we can leave the Declaration of Independence behind. For the progressives, there are no longer any God-given natural rights because there's no God. And therefore, there is nothing that we can expect to receive other than what the state gives us. These progressive ideas transformed American politics. Thomas West says, quote, "It was a total rejection in theory and a partial rejection in practice of the principles and policies on which America had been founded and on the basis of which the Civil War had been fought and won only a few years earlier." While our nation was initially formed by a revolution, an effort by many people to change the nature of the government that would rule America, what progressives have done has been dramatically different than that initial revolution. The phrase coup d'etat comes to mind. The French word and phrase literally means stroke of state, and it generally refers to the attempt of a small group of individuals to seize the levers of power in order to alter the form of government. Sometimes it is done in the dead of night while the general population is asleep, and whether or not we stay asleep, as we'll see, is up to us. Now, in the secular progressive state, government becomes all-powerful. At the core of secular progressivism, again, is a deep faith in science as the only thing that can tell us what's true and what is not. Now, out of this faith in science came the progressive idea of government as an overarching human institution shepherding its people. Government was to be filled with experts wielding the tools fashioned by science as the proper instrument for the perfecting of human society. And yes, that is what they believe, as we'll see in their own words. Now, there is no doubt that the era of progressivism, this historical period between 1880 and 1920, which has formed the basis of everything we understand about progressivism 100 years later. There's no doubt that during those formative years, it was a time of intense and disruptive change in America. However, progressive intellectuals believed that the rapid changes occurring over the American landscape were so vast and happening so swiftly that the older constitutional regime was unequipped to deal with it. This is what they believed. Because of their belief in the inerrancy of science, progressives saw an expanding government bureaucracy as the best way forward in dealing with the coming changes. And moreover, this army of bureaucrats would many times, out of necessity, circumvent voters, go around the voters, as the true arbiters of public policy. Now, in 1887, when Woodrow Wilson was a professor, he would later become president, he wrote an article in which he complained that America's future success was, quote, made doubtful by that besetting error of ours, the error of trying to do too much by vote. Instead, Woodrow Wilson praised the European style of government, democratic governance by administrators. And he noticed and noted with satisfaction that that continent's citizens, quote, could be expected to be very docile and acquiescent in learning what things they don't have a right to think and speak about with authority. Americans, on the other hand, Wilson said, tended to be meddlesome. He actually used that word. He said, quote, the cook must be trusted with a large discretion as to the management of the fires and the ovens, close quote. Now, I don't know about you, but the bigger government gets, the less I trust it. It is the idea behind Wilson's comment, as he used a metaphor for government, that people just need to trust the government to do what is good for them. In a 1912 presidential campaign speech, Wilson, who was then governor of New Jersey, he described the process by which he expected America to be transformed. And he likened the activity of a beneficent government working to fashion society, he likened that to a crew hired by homeowners to add to their home. The architects, he said, would work gradually and patiently on the alterations to the home, Wilson declared, quote, until finally, a generation or two from now, the scaffolding will be taken away and there will be the family in a great building whose noble architecture will at last be disclosed, where men can live as a single community, cooperative as in a perfected, coordinated beehive, end quote. Now, for constitutionalists, people who believe in the founding principles, who have become somewhat jaded at the incessant calls by progressives for bigger and more government, Wilson's blunt words 100 years ago are chilling. He was proposing a society that seemed more in line with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World than the land of the free. The founders did not believe American citizens were worker drones in a beehive, no matter how coordinated it was. That was an alien idea to the founders. The America envisioned by Woodrow Wilson and other progressives was nothing like the republic established by our founding fathers. Matthew Spalding said, quote, thus began the most revolutionary change of the last 100 years, the massive shift of power from institutions of constitutional government to a labyrinthine network of unelected, unaccountable experts who would rule in the name of the people. Now, for progressives, if government was to refashion human society, then that government must of necessity be unlimited. That's what they believed. Matthew Spalding noted that the progressive idea was worlds away from the founding fathers. The founders emphasized a separation of powers which divided and checked the government. Because the founders' beliefs were rooted in the Judeo-Christian worldview, they understood human beings were fallen. They could not be trusted with larger and larger amounts of power. So the founding fathers, in looking at history, and looking at the history of democracies and the history of republics that had failed, understood that you cannot allow the concentration of power in the hands of a small group of people. That was an oligarchy. So they designed a constitution which, in a sense, fragmented power, it separated it. Federal, state, local governments, even the three main branches of the federal government split up: executive, congressional, judicial. And there were checks and balances among those because the founders knew you could not concentrate power, you had to separate it. Progressives, however, sought a combination of powers which would concentrate its authority and direct the actions of the government. I mean, how else do you think we have wound up in Washington, D.C. with extra constitutional monoliths like the alphabet soup departments in the federal government, EPA, the Department of Education, all these kinds of, the IRS, all these kinds of huge behemoths? That is a result of the progressive ideas of concentrating power in the federal government. When Woodrow Wilson dreamt aloud of a perfected, coordinated beehive, this wasn't hyperbole. One of the pioneers in the formative years of the progressive movement was John Burgess. He was a law professor at Columbia University. He was a founder of the discipline of political science in the United States. In 1890, he wrote that the purpose of the state was, quote, the perfection of humanity, the civilization of the world, the perfect development of the human reason, and its attainment to universal command over individualism. I guess for progressives, you can't have individuals mucking up the beehive. This process of perfecting human beings and perfecting man, according to progressives, would not occur overnight. And this is according to one of the most influential progressives of the last century, Charles Merriam. He was a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He was also an advisor to several U.S. presidents, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Merriam admitted that this perfecting process of humanity awaited the coming of a universal state. He said, quote, "This end, that is, the perfection of humanity, can be realized only when a world state is organized. And for this, mankind is not yet ready." Now, Christians who have even a superficial understanding of what the Bible says is coming in the last days should feel a shiver run up their spines to hear a statement like that, and so long ago, over 100 years ago. And it is clear that to this day, progressives still believe in this globalist vision of a transnational superstate. So we look at this, and my opinion is that resisting the worldview that underlies or lies underneath the progressive movement is not merely a question of Republican versus Democrat or conservative versus liberal. Good-willed people can disagree on, say, the amount of taxes the government should collect and how much we should spend or the extent of the welfare state. Those kinds of simple political clashes, in my view, are occurring above the waves. But beneath the surface, there is a surge of forces. There is a clashing of streams that I think will determine the fate of Western civilization and perhaps humanity itself. The progressive movement represents the latest salvo from antichrist rebels who believe man can attain to perfection while denying God as creator, redeemer, and judge. According to Romans chapter 1, they are suppressing the knowledge of the truth and exalting mankind to a place of dominance that God never intended for us to have. Now, the founding fathers might not have all been born-again Christians, but they understood enough about nature, especially human nature, not to build a republic on shifting sand. Now, it is my view that progressivism, if it is allowed to continue its dominance and continue spreading, progressivism will result in the destruction of the Constitution. Now, for more than 100 years, of course, secular progressives have been quietly overturning those foundational principles that our founding fathers gave to us and replacing them with a view of mankind that is rooted in evolutionary materialism. Progressives, again, also known as secular humanists, believe only a government filled with experts could protect and direct human society. Therefore, they believed such a task required an unlimited government with unlimited power. And I want to explore some of the things progressives have said in a little bit more detail, this idea of the Leviathan state. Political science professor, as I mentioned, very influential progressive Charles Merriam, said in 1903 that there is really no line that the state should not cross. He said, quote, "It is not admitted that there are no limits to the action of the state, but on the other hand, it is fully conceded that there are no natural rights which bar the way." Since progressives dispensed with God, or so they thought, and since they therefore dispensed with natural law and the concept of natural rights, what's to stop government from doing what it wanted? This is what Merriam was saying. Now, for progressives, there was one big fat obstacle for such a grand humanistic vision, and that was the U.S. Constitution. Our founders intended it to act as a brake on government power. In fact, the entire Bill of Rights was added because there were states that would not ratify the Constitution without clear and substantial limitations to government power. Of course, the founders understood that the Constitution would have to be changed from time to time, and they included a process by which the document could be amended. However, that is a slow and often laborious process. It's hard to amend the Constitution. That's the way the founders designed the system. But that's a problem for progressives who want to change things rapidly. So secular humanists invented a new concept, the living Constitution. It would be flexible. Now, many Americans may think that this idea of a living Constitution is recent, but it's not. It's not recent at all. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson said in a campaign speech in 1912, he said, quote, "Living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism and must obey the laws of life, not of mechanics. It must develop. All the progressives ask or desire is permission in an era when evolution is the scientific word to interpret the Constitution according to this Darwinian principle. Some citizens of this country have never got beyond the Declaration of Independence." That last statement's staggering. The President of the United States declaring some citizens of this country have never got beyond the Declaration of Independence. Now, some have used the word Leviathan to describe the all-powerful state which protects and nurtures man. Thomas Hobbes, who is one of the most famous and most influential political philosophers of the 1600s, used the term Leviathan in this way. Many Bible commentators use the image of the dragon Leviathan in a different way, as a symbol of great political powers that are organized against God or His people. Now, there's no doubt that there's quite a bit of truth in Hobbes's view, the view of Thomas Hobbes, that government power can be constructive at times. In fact, Romans 13 in the New Testament states that government authority is ordained by God to reward good behavior and punish wickedness. But our founders understood the warning of Scripture, too, that when power is aggregated and concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people, it becomes an oligarchy. It becomes the Bible's Leviathan. In analyzing the idea of the all-powerful state in 1938, that was as the rise of a Nazified Germany cast its shadow across Europe, there was a German political theorist named Carl Schmitt who examined this symbol of Leviathan and approved of it as all-powerful. He said, quote, "Hobbes's Leviathan is the mortal God which brings to man peace and security. Because of this, Leviathan demands unconditional obedience. There exists no right of resistance to him, neither by invoking a higher nor a different right, nor by invoking religious reasons and arguments. He alone punishes and rewards. Based on Leviathan's sovereign power, he alone determines by law, in questions of justice, what is right and proper, and, in matters pertaining to religious beliefs, what is truth and error." That was a trade-off that progressives were willing to make: safety and progress under the tutelage of the Leviathan state. Of course, the secular humanists would be at the controls of that all-powerful state. We see this idea of Leviathan, of what Carl Schmitt was talking about, this all-powerful state that tells people what is right and what is wrong. We see this in constitutional decisions, the Supreme Court, for example, in the Obergefell marriage decision, and even going back a couple of decades, other decisions by the Supreme Court, when they rejected out of hand any religious arguments at all concerning the nature of marriage. They said, we're just not going to allow those kinds of ideas to enter the public debate. They were fulfilling Carl Schmitt's prophecy, if you will, that the Leviathan state would simply declare what was right and what was wrong. Now, this represented a tectonic shift underneath the edifice that was the American Republic. The founders believed the words of the Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Progressives completely dismissed these foundational ideals. Leviathan would determine how everyone else would live, what rights they had, and whether or not they were allowed to exercise them. Charles Merriam said, quote, "In speaking of natural rights, therefore, it is essential to remember that these alleged rights have no political force whatsoever unless recognized and enforced by the state. Now, it's undoubtedly difficult for most Americans to believe this idea, stated so tersely by Merriam, that is what progressives believe today. Secular humanists, however, not only believe that there is no God, but that we have no natural rights either. There is only the state. Although the years are receding into the dim past, one only has to remember, for example, that American children used to be allowed to pray in schools. They used to be allowed to see the Ten Commandments posted on the hallway walls. Nativity scenes were common on public grounds during Christmas. High school football games began with an opening prayer. What happened? What happened to all these things? Didn't the founders state clearly that religious expression could not be infringed by the government? Well, yes, they did state that. But because progressive ideas had so permeated the nation's law schools in the first half of the 20th century, the U.S. Supreme Court had no problem dispensing with these natural rights. Without a single precedent, the High Court created new standards by which it could begin the process of scrubbing away the free exercise of religion, because Christianity in this country was a competing force with progressive ideology. Leviathan simply decreed that it would be so. Well, is there a way back? This is a difficult question to answer. The progressive faction in this nation believes that there is no God and thus no absolute morality. For the secularist, man is the highest being on earth and the governmental state is the highest authority. Humanists believe that society's elites should make the decisions that are important, and human rights are granted by the state, not God. The America they are building has a motto that is different from the one we currently have. The progressive motto is, "In man we trust." On the other hand, while we are witnessing the disheartening results of forsaking the founders' wisdom, many Christians refuse to allow this terrible tragedy to destroy our nation. Christians operate under a different worldview. It is the worldview of our founders. Even as late as 1956, our national leaders validated that foundation when Congress adopted our national motto, "In God we trust." We understand that there is only one who can unite this disintegrating nation, but that can only happen when the hearts of His people are united to His. That has been the only route even for people who don't believe in God, the only route for individuals, communities, and nations to true blessing and peace. So there's only one course of action for people who do not wish to grant to Leviathan such all-encompassing power, and that is to do something. So here are some very quick principles to guide us. One, it is never too late to do what's right. Brother Don Wildman, who founded American Family Association, his motto was, "God has not called us to be successful, He's called us to be faithful." In human history, there have always been times when the outlook was bleak. That even includes the Revolutionary War, many times of bleak and grim circumstances. Thomas Paine famously said, I don't know in how many schools they still teach this, but he said, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value." So it's never too late to do what's right. Second of all, teach the next generation. Let every school board demand that children be taught the views of the Founding Fathers. Let every parent educate their children in the principles of liberty. Third, being salt and light is what Christians are called to do. Of course, being salt means to resist corruption, add flavor to the life of the community. Light means that we should always be about teaching God's truth. The Scriptures teach men and women how they are to order their lives if they wish to prosper. Number 4, reality is a brutal teacher. Progressivism is a lie, and because it is a lie, it is not true. Now, that might sound so obvious as to be unworthy of stating, but we must keep in mind that lies eventually unravel, and we can pray for the truth to become obvious once again to Americans. We need God. God is the one in whom we trust. Unfortunately, truth sometimes intrudes painfully, and that's why we must always remember the fifth and final suggestion I have. There may be many others, but the fifth one is the power of God in the gospel. Now, this is the only instrument of permanent individual change. And once individuals change, marriages, families, schools, communities, and nations can change. So Christians must always be about the business of preaching the eternal gospel. In George Washington's first inaugural address, that titan of liberty said that, quote, "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government has been ultimately staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people." Our founding generation were handing off this experiment and entrusting it to us. And it seems to me that Washington was looking to us as much as we look to him. And it's time once more for Leviathan to be placed in chains. Thank you.